Okay, I think we're preparing to go live.
We are streaming live.
Okay, if we are streaming live, hello.
Hello.
Welcome to Growing Down Podcast. We have Layman Pascal here and Ryan Nakade. Matt will not be with us today. He's on vacay or something or other. I forgot exactly what's going on, but he's with us in spirit for today. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Ryan to introduce Layman.
Yes, so welcome to another episode of Growing Down. Today we are here with a man who needs no introduction in integral circles, especially on in online integral and on integral Facebook. And Layman is the co-founder and host of the Integral Stage series on YouTube, and is just quite a prominent voice in integral communities. Always has very interesting things to say, and most importantly, is a self-professed religious fanatic. So, Layman, thank you so much for joining us today, Swami Laymananda.
Great to be here, guys. Love your show.
Thank you, and yes, and everyone should go and check out Layman's work on the integral stage. So, Layman, I thought we would just start off with a small question, just to get us warmed up for today. Okay. Is America fucked?
Yes, and in several different ways at several different timescales. But fucked things are not necessarily unfuckable.
Off to a good start.
Obviously, there's, from the rest of the world's point of view, America's fumbling is the positive interpretation, self-sabotaging is the negative interpretation. It's setting up a system that doesn't look like it's capable of adapting to accumulating inevitable and surprising crises that are already occurring. And turning this boat around is going to be hard enough without people pulling the wiring out and deliberately trying to sink it. There's a huge amount of cultural habits in the United States, some of which are good, but some of which are preventing it from becoming any better than it's been. Everything's like interlocked, you'd have to change the political culture in order to change the system that you use to do politics, but you'd really have to change the system you use to do politics in order to make a significant change in the culture. So everything's interlocked and holding itself in place. But on the other hand, that means you could make a change anywhere and it might open the whole thing up. So I'm optimistic, even though America looks fucked. At the same time, I'm temperamentally optimistic, so that might not mean anything.
And as a Canadian, you can kind of give an outsider perspective. I mean, what are your thoughts on all of the just craziness and chaos and conflict around race in America, and all of the events that have transpired and cascaded since the death of George Floyd till now?
It's interesting. Canadians get to pat themselves on the back for being, in our view, slightly better than the Americans. And that's a very dangerous position because it means we don't feel motivated to get much better than we already are. We have our own racial issues. It's very difficult to know whether protest does anything, right? If we're looking at a situation in which we've seen rising authoritarianism around the world for decades, these have also been the decades in which the most people have been mobilized to make the most public outcry of their values and their desire for change. So we should look very carefully as to whether this kind of response to a tragedy, murder, and horror is in fact a response that gets us anywhere. One of the things I always think about was a thing that happened during the run-up to the Gulf War, which was George Bush was in London and there was a mobilized protest in England, and it was the largest recorded peace protest in human history. And what he said to the protesters was, "We're going to war to protect your right to be able to do this." Now, what that means was they wanted the war not to go ahead. And what he heard from them was confirmation that the war should go ahead. So that was the largest peace protest in history. And the effect was the exact opposite of the intention of the protesters. So protest is pretty dicey. Obviously, you're looking at a situation that's very interesting with race, right? A lot of that racial problem is actually just a subset of the general socioeconomic and cultural difficulty down there. There's a lot of upstream things that would fix a lot of the racial problem. But even if you did that, there's sort of a lingering psychic or collective, emotional, unconscious phenomenon around race that would have to be addressed anyway.
Yeah, so maybe this is a good time to just jump right into the essay you shared with us called The Restoration Project 1156. Do you want to kind of premise that for us, the meaning of what the Restoration Project is and why specifically 1156?
1156 is a number that I love. It's the number I see most often on clocks. I always thought it would be a good name for a novel with the subtitle 4 minutes left. And you wouldn't know what those 4 minutes were leading up to. It would just be an ambiguous precipice. It's also the post office box I had as a kid. What I did with the 1156 number is just to make it different than any other possible restoration project, because restoration is a very popular, nice sounding word, and there could be any number of restoration projects. But what I was trying to do was to get down some initial ideas that bubbled out of me on a hike about how you set up the tone and values by which progressive and conservative influences could work together. And so the kind of angle there is that conservative in the sense of pre-modern, not necessarily in the sense of the right wing of any stage of development, but in the sense of traditionalism, of symbolic, a little bit pre-rational, those people need to hear symbolic confirmation of their values, whereas progressives or post-formal thinkers, they need to understand that there's going to be a complex system upgrade. So if you bring those things together, you could say something like, I do this in the article, and Bernie could have done this, it's American socialism, right? And you underline American. The underline is purely symbolic, but it's a purely symbolic shout out to people who are essentially symbolic people. Whereas the socialism part is a shout out to people who are complex thinkers who believe the system needs a significant upgrade. So there's a kind of logic to that aesthetic that you could run all the way down. And if you wanted to make system change, then you've got to mobilize people. If you're going to mobilize people, you need an ethos. If you need an ethos, there's an argument that ethoses are downstream of aesthetics. You have to start working on a mood, Christianity was sort of something in ancient Rome that you heard about. Maybe you saw a cross, maybe you saw a fish, right? It took centuries of building people's ambiguous sense of what these people were up to before it had enough social momentum to become the dominant church of the Roman Empire. So there's a sense in which you seed projects with moods. And the mood of the Restoration Project, or what it's trying to think out, is the kind of mood where left and right, progressive and conservative could integrate together. Because if they don't, there's really no chance of them overturning or upgrading entrenched modern power and the metaphysics of modernity.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly comment too that Harvey J.K. talked about this quite a bit in the election cycle during the primaries for Bernie in terms of the kind of rhetoric he was approaching, popularizing democratic socialism and de-emphasizing the socialism and emphasizing the American, as you're talking about here, by hearkening back to, of course, FDR, the New Deal, the kind of great American projects, the sort of grand American projects after a period of economic collapse and depression. So, yeah, I think there is something, especially to that. And even sort of in the context of the recent DNC and RNC, I'm thinking about how, now I could be wrong, but I watched the DNC and I watched the RNC, and I have to say that Trump's rhetoric, while it is a bit discombobulated, it's still aesthetically on point. It's exactly where it needs to be. It is populist. It is going to attract people. It is saying the things in the right way, even if we can criticize, and rightly so, the kind of policy work that he's actually doing, which is, completely against the populist class that is supporting him in terms of his voter base. So rhetoric, aesthetics, presentation, I think these are so important. And as long as the left or progressives or centrists, for that matter, and you comment on that in the article about developing a sort of anti-centrism, which we can talk about, as long as we don't have the appropriate rhetoric, or as you're saying, aesthetic, what are we doing? And I think with the DNC, we saw kind of there's interesting, like, how would you tease this apart from, let's say, what the DNC was doing, which arguably is a form of restoration, right? Biden saying we need to restore the soul of America. He's trying to empathize with loss and pain during the pandemic by talking about, you know, tragedies in his own family. So there was an appeal to that, but can we make some distinctions about how that kind of centrist appeal and aesthetic might be different from what you're talking about?
There's a similarity and there's a difference. I mean, if what I'm talking about makes any sense, then it's something that describes the workability of any political platform, right? Insofar as the DNC, say, wins this upcoming election, that means they did something right in terms of their propaganda, in terms of their messaging, right? And maybe they're doing it a little bit better than Trump is at the moment, because Trump has one side of the equation, but he doesn't have the other side, right? At best, he can call out to 40% of the people. Maybe that's enough under the right conditions, maybe it's not. Right, the Biden people are trying to build a coalition, and they traditionally, the Democrats have been decent about that, right? Like Bill Clinton, whose policies I don't love, was pretty good at bringing together things that sounded simultaneously progressive and conservative. In fact, Obama was pretty good at setting out a conservative dog whistle and a progressive dog whistle simultaneously. But to take the project forward, to use this kind of workability to empower progressives whose basic systemic insights, I think, are absolutely necessary, both for humanitarian reasons of human well-being, but also just to prepare society for the earthquakes that are absolutely coming. They have to be empowered, and they have to do it in a way that understands that centrists are sort of their enemy, right? There's times to work with your enemy. The November election may be a time to work with your enemy, but you have to understand that in a way, the problem is liberalism. The problem is the DNC, right? That you can easily say that Republicans are almost a boogeyman that liberal moderates use. Right? You're allowed to vote that way sometimes, and that's proof that you really should be sticking with a centrist, liberal, moderate agenda. So they are the entrenched power structure. When they fail, then you get an eruption of an obscene shadow version of it that we think of as sort of disturbing, destabilizing right-wing people, but really they're a sort of adjunct to the general liberal power control structure that's been dominant on this planet in most countries for a couple of centuries now. It's really good at holding itself in place. It's really good at co-opting the rhetoric and identity of both progressives and conservatives. And a huge amount of what we think of as identity politics and the right and the left is actually still just the middle holding sway. So if you're going to dislodge that middle, you're going to need all the allies you can get. You're going to need both the progressives and the anti-centrist, in a way, regressives or pre-modernist individuals to work together somehow, right? Because even a couple of percent might be the difference between winning or losing an election, or being able to sway a legislature or not sway a legislature. So somehow we need to spiritually and aesthetically start to figure out how to mobilize the right and the left, the progressive and the pre-modern simultaneously. You know, we don't ultimately want to shove modernity and liberalism out of the equation, but it's so swollen, it's so predominant, it's so much behind all of the things we're suffering that it has to be sort of reset in its place. It reminds me of McLuhan's notion about how we've shifted with electronic media from an eye-dominant culture to a situation in which the eye is set back again amongst the hand and the ear, right? We didn't get rid of reading, but reading, it doesn't have this privileged position. It's the kind of reading that occurs on a poster or an illuminated manuscript. It's set back in with the hand and the ear. I think modernity has to be set back in with progressives and pre-modernists. It can't be the dominant architecture in which all the rest of it is subsumed anymore. And in order to do that, everybody else has to become really clear that this is our basic enemy. Maybe we work with them sometimes, but fundamentally, liberal modernity and centrism is the enemy, so to speak.
Yeah, beautifully said. How do you think your essay and the ideas in there compare to like what the Hill Rising is doing with Crystal and Sagar, or what some of I don't know if you know who Kim Iverson is, who also did a little bit on how we can have this left-right populist alliance, and she threw out some pretty wacky like examples of like a Bernie Sanders, Steve Bannon ticket, or like a what was it, Tulsi Gabbard, Ivanka Trump, and it's just thinking outside the box here. I'm wondering how much that comports with what you're after.
I think a lot of people are intuiting that we have to go forward in this direction somehow. And they all have different levels of sophistication in terms of how they imagine that playing out. Some of them are utterly ridiculous, but also it's okay for things to be ridiculous, right? Trump is ridiculous and he's the president. You can be astonishing. In fact, you should be astonishing, peculiar, mind-blowing. If people look at it and they go, that makes sense and it's exactly what I expected, then you aren't really outputting any political message at all. You have to be quasi-shamanic. You have to be blowing minds, because we're always electing a surpriser in chief, especially the Americans. So you've got to, I think, take seriously the fact that many people who are currently working on bridging that gap, like Crystal and Sagar, with whatever level of success they're having, they're working on bridging that gap. And what they're seeing is a possibility of some kind of aesthetic hybrid economic populism that could challenge the establishment. I think they're absolutely feeling their way forward towards this same kind of thing that I've been speaking about. And I think if you look around, a lot of people are sensing it. They just don't know how it would really work. But you don't necessarily have to know how it would work to get started. Like I'm saying, you might just start with the mood. Because if you don't have the mood, how do you verify a policy? How do you verify a candidate? How do you know if something fits until you have a solid sense of what the mood is supposed to be? Right? Conservatives and liberals both have a very strong sense of their mood. They can do that very well. Progressives and a progressivism that combines left and right, it has to know what its mood is and be able to output that and stand with it unrepentantly and be okay with that disturbing people. Because if you try to make a left-right hybrid that excludes the middle, you're going to upset everybody. Right? Progressives aren't going to like it. Conservatives aren't going to like it. Liberals aren't going to like it. And you have to think that that's okay. When the feedback comes and they're all against it, that's a success indicator, not a failure indicator. Because if you modified at that point, you would be succumbing to the logic of the current status quo, which is a classic liberal move, right? Yes, absolutely. We love your policies. If you just scale back, if you just stop being so upfront about it, if you'd stop being so radical, if you'd stop being so mean, if you'd stop being so much of what you are, then we could enfold you, right? That's their offer to everybody. And that's hugely dangerous, because what they ask of you is to step down from the thing that makes you distinct from them. It's an absolute power move. And very often progressives fall into it because progressives are often sensitive, nice people.
And just to comment really quickly, what I found interesting about your piece was basically you're talking about kind of memetic creative remixing and taking different memes and creating new aesthetics, new hybrids that not only have a novel, ethos or aesthetic to them, but they're also integrating formally polarized or dichotomous memes or values, right, or ideas. And I was reading Crystal and Sagar's book on the Populist Guide to 2020, and they gave Yang, Tulsi, and Marianne Williamson as 3 examples of people who are doing these remixing, right? Tulsi is a progressive who mixes in kind of this conservative nationalist flavor, often appears on Fox News and on IDW spaces. Yang is mixing progressivism with libertarianism and libertarian talking points, right? The freedom dividend, emphasizing freedom is kind of a libertarian, moral rouser. And then Marianne Williamson with her spirituality and kind of winning over some of the new age crowd and mixing that with progressive policy. So I think we can break down with even more distinction what are the actual memetic camps or tribes that are under the umbrella of conservatism, and then really start to get really creative in how we mix and match and create new aesthetics and memes around very specific segments of that. I don't know if you've thought more about other types of what that would look like or anything.
Well, I think remixing is a great metaphor. It's very appropriate to the current technological moment. Juxtapositions and mashups and things like that proliferate within digital media, and we should be taking that in as something that patterns our approach to how politics should feel. There's people doing it at different levels. If you look at, say, Tulsi and Yang, you get a feeling like they, in their being, have really mixed a lot of those things in an unusual, interesting way, right? If you listen to Buttigieg's rhetoric, sounds like he's done the same thing. First time I saw him was on Bill Maher saying that Democrats should reclaim the language of God and patriotism, right? That's very smart. It's just that Pete doesn't really feel like he is consistently backing up the things he says, but the things he says are reaching that place. He's got an interesting mix. And so a lot of people are doing it in a lot of different ways. I think the tendency, as with most things in life, and certainly with integral theory, the tendency is to be too focused on the verbal, right? If you just focused on the verbal, you'd think Buttigieg was doing it. You know, Steve McIntosh is a guy who's also got a really good look at post-progressive or meta-progressive politics and the way it has to fold in different values to make a better blend. But when I talk to him, I usually get the sense that this is about people, individuals recognizing and verbally clarifying their values and being able to speak to each other's values. And so much of that goes on at the verbal level, which is the easiest level to fail at, right? Anybody can say anything. Whereas if we started with moods, images, things like that, you might get a better grounding, right? My idea of just, it's Jack Daniel's whiskey and kale, right? That image or anything like that, right? Anything which says heartland and cosmopolitanism, anything that says the coastal elites and the rural Americans, anything that has both of those in it. I gave a few in the article, right? It's a pickup truck with solar panels in it. It's both of those things. People, I think, over time can key into that subconsciously and emotionally much better than they can key into people's verbal articulations of these points. And verbal articulations of these points are extremely unreliable. One of the problems that more educated people have when it comes to politics is that we tend to think people are that they mean the policies they propose and that they're going to try to act out the things they said. When, you know, how impressive is it to be able to read off a teleprompter? So if we associate a politician with their common statements, we really don't know anything about them yet. We'd be much better off to turn the sound off and watch the debates. Because just like with integral development, the bit that you can say about your values and worldview is negligible. So we need to be looking at other levels and ways of communicating with people politically, other than trying to get them to agree with our statements about how the country should be. So you got to do this mixing on different lines, so to speak.
Yeah, I think you know, especially in the electronic digital age, the most famous example they use in media ecology classes, right, is the debate between what was it? It was Nixon and Reagan. Am I correct there? One of the first televised political presidential debates, and of course Nixon was all kind of sweaty. He had very good Kennedy, yeah. And Nixon, of course, was all sweaty and he didn't have very good presentation, but he was very articulate. And if you were listening to that on the radio, it sounds very different than watching it on the television with the young Kennedy appearing very confident, obviously much more put together, etc. So, you know, I think with electronic media, these media ecologies have already remixed, right? It is a aesthetic, symbolic, charismatic approach that requires some level of embodiment, and then also doesn't mean we have to kind of move away from the print age or the age of contractual agreements and like, oh yes, I believe your 10 points about how to change America. I agree with those points. This is a very sound debate. No. It's how you show up. Like, and this is what I'm worried about, just in terms of, we'll see how it goes, and the polls are showing what they show right now in terms of it's kind of close. But you know, Trump during the RNC presentation turned around to the White House and said, "I'm here, he's not," right? I mean, just him doing that, presenting himself in that way is showing, and this Trump is a very literate when it comes to media and his own presentation. He knows exactly how to manipulate that. So yeah, I believe that we really do have to navigate a subtextual or post-textual media environment where all of those things need to come into play, right? They all have to come into play together somehow. So I think you have some great examples there. I wonder if you've checked out, and this doesn't get enough traction, and I think it's been compounded because of how Ocasio-Cortez has been sort of seen as this super leftist Marxist who's trying to take over the country with her progressive values. I think the media has switched it around a little bit, but she had a fantastic Green New Deal campaign. The artwork for it is sort of exactly what you're talking about, just like hardworking Americans, you know, laborers and workers building this new reconstruction project across the United States with all of the great new, you know, eco-friendly projects, et cetera, making jobs. I mean, it's a great kind of propaganda campaign for the Green New Deal. And so I was thinking that as you were sort of describing the solar truck or something along those lines. But I was wondering if you have any comments on that kind of approach. And
I think that's great. It's very much what I'm saying, which is you work with aesthetics to plant the seeds of a new ethos. And that ethos has got to combine things that are traditionally considered to be left and right so that they can potentially form a new center distinct from the center that currently defines them as left and right. The McLuhan situation is very interesting. McLuhan sort of, let's say, when he talks about obsolescing and retrieving things from the world through each new technology, like when we lay out the digital system, we bring back a lot of insights that were always true about people. We just didn't notice because we were print dominant for a while and not actually very long. So the digital media brings back some of the archaic tropes. It brings us back to shamanism. It's not that shamanism was missing. It's that we didn't notice it properly because we weren't using a pro-shamanic, a pro-archaic, a pro-indigenous, a pro-oral, acoustic, magical kind of medium, and we are now. So that kind of shamanic approach to politics is hugely important. Like a lot of the things when I think about politics are on what Wilbur would call the lower right. A lot of them are, how do we improve the system that we live in? How do we improve the economy? How do we change the voting system? How do we upgrade our collective intelligence protocols so we get smarter results out of a group decision rather than dumber results? There's a lot of focus on that, but there's also this other side, which is, how do we feel? What do we know? What's inspiring us? What's the mutual spirit? What's the common mood, which is fundamentally situated in our shared unconscious rather than our shared consciousness? So how do you shamanically work with the masses of people? Because that's one of the things, that's a skill set that our archetype of the shaman used to exhibit. How do you work with the combined unconscious of the people? And that's something that very often the worst politicians are very good at because they have nothing else to offer. But people with really good programs and candidates of high integrity have got to work with the same kind of magic. So we've got to be focused on the sorts of Paleolithic experience that are being retrieved in the digital age. And that's, you know, uncanny juxtapositions is a big part of what's been retrieved with the internet. Every meme is in a way an uncanny juxtaposition. But all the last, you know, 5 or 6 American presidents, certainly all the ones since the internet started, they've been uncanny, right? Bill Clinton was weird. George Bush Jr. was weird. You know, a black guy named Hussein, that's weird. There's all these sort of astonishments involved in politics, which the shaman knew how to use, right? The shaman comes back from spending all day in the graveyard covered in ash. Nobody knows why. It blows their mind. They can't figure out why he's presenting such a strange conjunction. And this notion of remixing and of putting together value systems and aesthetics from different parts of the map of the political organism of the nation, that's a way of trying to tap into the power of uncanny juxtapositions, which I think digital media retrieves from the archaic.
yeah, well said. In agreement there. I think the uncanny juxtapositions in Gebser's language is sort of the magical consciousness, right? Which is very much this idea that in the creative process itself, I mean, creativity is combinatorial. It's taking something, it's remixing it, it's digesting it, it's matching it with something that is surprising, right? So in this sort of creative immanence, this plane of immanence in which these images co-arise and converge, that's where the most energy is, right? So I think you're absolutely right that someone who is sensitive enough to the media environment in which we live is someone who is actually able to, like an artist, play with those juxtapositions, present themselves with those, use those to in some sense commandeer the attention economy, right? And create a sort of a charismatic engagement to surprise, to astonish, to influence, right? So I would love to see more of that. And maybe we can kind of go into, in your article, you talked quite a bit about, actually, I really like these 2 points, but I'm going to go through number 4 a little bit, because number 5, we've been sort of talking about the propaganda aesthetic already. But I want to kind of get into 5 and then maybe jump to 6 after that. But 4 and then 6, because 4, you talk about needing to be, or the political spirit of today needing to be anti-fragile. And I wondered if you would like to kind of unpack what you mean by that. Is this more of the lower right sense of anti-fragile? I have a clue that it might also be the lower left as well in terms of the aesthetics.
I think there's a mood, or let's say a set of moods, that are more amenable to anti-fragility in systems than are some of the other moods. There's a certain, I mean, that's one of the things you often vote for in American elections, which is a sense of somebody who's going to oppose the system. They're proposing a liberty. They're proposing a throwing off of something, which means it sounds to the people like those people know how to profit from that, right? Trump is very anti-fragile as an individual, right? He's gone through enormous disasters, mismanagement, all kinds of things, and he's always profited from it. And so you could look at that and say, well, if he could do that for the country, absolutely, that's what we should be doing. Now, he can't do that for the country. He does it for himself at the expense of others. But in principle, that's the kind of skill, and that's the kind of mood, a certain insouciance, a certain indifference, right? An element of his charisma and the charisma of most presidents is this sense that they might step beyond the system at any moment. They might be up to something you can't see. They might change things radically in ways you're not sure of, but they look like they're confident about that they could pull that off, that it would benefit them. The way anti-fragility technically differs from resilience is not just that you withstand shocks, surprises, stress, and time, but that you might be able to benefit from chaos, surprises, shocks, stress, and time. So how do you build a politics that has the kind of anti-fragility of people who don't care about truth and only use symbols, right? Those people have a lot of anti-fragility because they can just dismiss anything anybody's saying. An attack on Trump, how does that land except with people who already dislike him? You can't get in there, in a sense. He's got that strength in a way that a rock musician does, right? This is the Nassim Taleb kind of example where a guy who wears a suit to work can't afford to be out of place. But if your job is playing rock music and they run a story saying you have 6 girlfriends and bit the head off a pigeon, all that does is increase your sales. Your job is amplified, right? You've gained from that shock. This becomes a really important issue in politics because a lot of what you do in politics is try to weaken your opponent by proposing something negative about them to the public. Now, you have to be able to handle that somehow. You have to be able to lean in. You have to be able to own whatever's arising. Maybe in the integral sense, we might call it the intersubjective shadow, right? A narrative comes up in the people, which is the negative narrative about you. And traditionally, if a politician can tap into the negative narrative about you, they can tarnish you. But the way that you can benefit from that, instead of being weakened by it, is that you lean into the narrative, accept it, embrace it, promote it, but spin it in your way. And that's a kind of thing that progressive politicians often have not been good at. You know, Bernie was instinctively good at it at times. Bernie was able to cross the aisle. Bernie was able to relate to a Republican crowd. Bernie was able to be humorous with people. These are all skills that go along with the kind of anti-fragility that leans into a shadow rather than recoils from it. But what we saw, or what we thought we saw when he came out of the race, was a kind of retraction. He was pulling back, that he was worried that his people weren't doing the right thing and weren't being nice enough. And he was withdrawing as if he was fragile. Now, Trump benefited from the kind of anti-fragility we're talking about. And almost any progressive politician should be doing things that are more astonishing, even more upsetting, the kind of things that the media is going to cover for free, right? Trump benefited enormously from hacking the centrist media incentive structure, which is to say they want to promote somebody who's like Joe Biden in a way. That's what cable news wants, but they also want eyeballs glued to screens. And if you come out and say on day one that Mexicans are rapists, they're going to cover that all week for free, even if they don't like you. So there's incentive structures that can be hacked throughout the modernist system. And a lot of the way to hack it is to lean into something that's upsetting rather than back up and try to show that you are a reasonable, well-behaved individual who makes sense. So there's a mood, this is where we started from. There's a sense of, hey, I can do that. It's okay. If somebody says something terrible about me, great. Let's work with that. Let's not try to oppose it. We don't want to get out there and just say they're wrong. We want to take over that energy, and we're confident enough to feel like maybe we can, even though that's a huge risk emotionally.
So this is something I really want to get your opinion on, Layman. So I've been thinking about Trump's anti-fragility, as you just articulated very well. And it seems like from a developmental perspective, I think Trump really is, or I should say Trump's power is his raw authenticity from being coherent at a lower stage of development. And so someone like Obama or even some of the GOP politicians started adopting Trump rhetoric, saying things and doing things that he did, they would be done instantly because there's such an incoherence between, say, how Obama presents himself to be, his identity, his image. And if he says Mexicans are rapists or what anything else Trump said, you're done, right? So how does an integral politician, an integral political movement that is supposed to be at a higher level of complexity with the more, cosmo-local, global, multi-dimensional awareness, complex systems thinking, very complex solutions to complex problems, try to maintain that level of authenticity and coherence and have an anti-fragility at that level, where it seems to be easier to do that when you're at a lower level. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it's a great question, because a lot of the examples of the things I've just been talking about are what you see at, let's call it pre-modern, right? And pre-modern is a little bit pre-rational. It's not concerned about inconsistency and logic. It hasn't really cemented that modern thing about double checking with reason and fact. It's not concerned. In fact, it is messaging to its own people when it says something incoherent. And the modern and postmodern people go, well, that's totally hypocritical. Look, isn't it hilarious? These people are saying the opposite of what they were saying a few days ago, or this guy, like it's blowing our minds. But they get it. They understand, because for them, loyalty is the basis of discourse. Fact and reason are not the basis of discourse. You change your facts and your reason constantly to demonstrate loyalty to your symbols and your team. So whenever they do that, they're winning. And they're comfortable demonstrating the kind of authenticity that goes along with incoherence and is therefore totally open to strange juxtapositions. But how do you do that if you're a smarter, more well-meaning human being? It's a tough question, but I think the answer comes from the fact that the style of doing this is different for everybody. You've got to do it with your own style, right? If you got to be president like Barack Obama did, that means you're capable of pulling this off to some degree, right? I remember some things about the Obama campaign where they were asked if he smoked pot because he'd admitted it in his book. And they said, did you inhale? Which was a reference to the Bill Clinton thing. And Obama said, of course, that's what it was for. Right. And you're just like, wow, maybe Bill Clinton didn't need to do any of that prevaricating. Maybe you can just cut that Gordian knot and move on. Right. There was a moment where Barack Obama unexpectedly visited the troops in Iraq for a day. That's a stunt. And one of the things that's really important, I think, that progressives need to get through their heads is that stunts are as important or more important than policies and speeches. Right? You can imagine a situation where Bernie just took 3 primaries in a row, and the next day you see him on the battlefield in Afghanistan all of a sudden with a helmet on, with the troops and generals. Right? And then you've just mixed in this uncanny juxtaposition from the other side. Even MSNBC, who might have an agenda against him, they're going to cover it because it's at that level of surprise. And it's going to say, I claim a whole additional set of aesthetics and values as part of my phenomenon. It would keep that momentum going, right? So that's the thing, that he's a very intellectually sophisticated and morally sophisticated individual. But that's a way that he could do that same kind of thing without interfering with his own authenticity. He would have to be able to make an argument for what he sees as the real value of defense and intervention in other countries in order to do that. But I think anybody at any level can do it if they can figure out their own style, and if they can move ahead, because Trump did this. Trump moved ahead by testing these things. I don't know if you guys used to watch his show, Celebrity Apprentice. It was amazing, especially when Gary Busey was on there. But the thing Trump did just before running for president was he did a Comedy Central roast. And he's not a guy with a great sense of humor. He sat there on a stage for 2 hours and let liberal comedians swear at him and savage his entire life and personality. Not a comfortable thing, but he was trying to lean into it. And if you go back through his whole biography, he's constantly trying to lean into those disturbing phenomena. And so that's an experimental method that you undertake to figure out your way of doing it, a way that comports with your authenticity and intelligence, right? It turns out he doesn't have a lot of authenticity and intelligence, so he can do it at a low level. But if you're Obama, if you're Bernie, if you're AOC, if you're anybody, there is a flavor for you, especially if you understand conjunctions and stunts and their importance. And also if you go at it in an experimentalist manner so that you organically find the way that you're capable of doing that.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I really appreciate how you're framing the uncanny and the unexpected and the wild and the shamanic. There's a kind of trickster archetype element or kind of magician aspect at play that's missing from a lot of boring normie style button down, Joe Biden kind of politics and the image and the class of people that he's trying to cater to with that image. And it's, I think, in the age of the internet, the cat's out of the bag, and we have to find new creative and wild kind of Nietzschean, Dionysian, ways of going about it too. So my question is specifically about the anti-fragile nature of conspiracy theorists, and now QAnon is now gaining some mainstream prominence, which to me is the whole phenomenon is quite disturbing. But I'm wondering, I guess the question, to put it bluntly, is what do we do with these people as a culture? And I think there's several ways we can think about how we can integrate them, right? One more of a rational approach would be, and I was watching your talk with my good friend Damiano, and he was talking to these flat earthers and these other guys, right? And you were saying the education system might have failed these people because they were basically told what to believe, like the earth is round, but they weren't really engaged in a participatory way to verify those claims through their own types of experiments and so forth. So one would be trying to integrate these people into larger systems of epistemic sense making, whether through something like post-normal science or citizen science or something. The other angle, I guess we could say, is it's more of a psychological or developmental or a symbolic thing that needs to be integrated. The wild, the uncanny, the unorthodox, the outside the box, even the esoteric and the occult, and the magical structure of consciousness. So like there are a lot of inroads into how we can think about reaching these people, integrating these people. What are your thoughts on all of this?
Well, like with a lot of things, all of that depends on time scales, right? So if you had a generation, if you were looking at that kind of time scale, then you'd say, well, what we need to do is set up conditions in which the next generation of these people are notably healthier and have a more enriched life than the people who feel that way at the moment do. But if you were talking about the next two elections, then you don't have that time. You can't do a transformation of their living conditions because I mentioned this with Damiano, I grew up on a big rural place where I got to act out my barbarism. I got to act out my traditionalism. We had all these opportunities, but a lot of people don't, right? One of the things modernity has done around the world is sabotage the ability of pre-modern people to live in pre-modern ways. And if you grow up without the opportunity, if you grow up without the environment, if you grow up without the livelihood options of pre-modernity, if you don't grow up without a space to express that and have that be okay, and to eat healthy food and be loved, and have a good version of it, then you're going to have a toxic, regressive version of these kind of thinkers. So there's always a question in developmental theory about health and unhealth. Right now, we have a lot of unhealthy pre-moderns, and a lot of that's because modernity was indifferent to the conditions that pre-modern people need. When it set up its system, it destabilized them completely. However, it also tends to destabilize itself. So it does create, like I was saying with Damiano, an education system in which modernity is treated like a dogma, And so why wouldn't people be dogmatic after coming through that system, right? If you are basically told the content of modernity, that the earth is a sphere, and then you get to adulthood and anybody gives you any bit of confidence and you say, you know what, I was told that all along, but I never felt it. I never got it. For me, what feels natural is it's basically flat and it's basically 6,000 years old. That feels about right. So that kind of person, we neglected them as modernity, right? Modernity didn't help them become modern. It just told them to be modern. And what it left was a whole bunch of traditionalist instincts that could be evolved into modernity if we had a different kind of education system backed up by a way of living and having an economy and having an environment that secures the opportunities for traditional people to be traditional as long as they want to. But again, we're not going to get there in 10 years. So within a 10-year frame, you have to look at how you could mobilize language and symbolism in order to try to tap into these people, right? So some of that is what we've been saying. Some of that is surprise. Some of that is the ancient, archaic, shamanic nature of politics that even well-meaning left-brain people have missed for a long time now, which is that a lot of what the politicians say is not what gets them elected. A lot of their election is based on their ability to blow your mind, because you're looking for somebody who can change the system. And so they have to show that they are half standing outside of the system, right? There's a gleam in George Bush Jr.'s eyes and a little chuckle that says, you don't know what he's up to, right? Bill Clinton went on TV and contested the meaning of the word is, right? You're just like, what the fuck is happening, Bill Clinton? You know, he's outputting a vibe that you can't grok. And Trump is doing that more than any of them, at least for the last 50 years. Every day, it's like, what did he say that we can't possibly process? So in that way, he's showing you that ancient thing that those people really respond to, which is he has the power to rule or transcend the system because he's showing he operates outside of our expectations of how the system operates. So you have to be able to output a message like that for those people to pick up. You know, one of the things they like about conspiracy theories, one of the things they like about Flatland, is not just that it comports with their instinct, it's because it makes no sense and they get to say something that makes no sense. You see this gleam in their eye, right? They're not just saying what they believe. They're also saying, I get to say this. It's totally fine. I can just mouth off and tell you whatever I want, and I can totally change my mind. It doesn't matter. So I've got a translinguistic confidence that this has given me, which is actually a pre-linguistic confidence in this sense. But we have to be able to speak to that, right? You can speak to nonsense. You can say things that blow minds. You can mix the left and the right. You can use the kind of aesthetic symbolic conjunctions we've been talking about, but you could also do different forms of languaging. Right? There's a beautiful thing in one of Jonathan Haidt's books, might be The Righteous Mind, where he says, hey, we went to people who were self-described liberals or conservatives, and we gave them these different documents about the environment, the ecological situation. And people who self-identified as liberal were able to go, oh, you're right, our environment is in a terrible situation. We should do something about that immediately. And people who self-identified as conservative were not turned on by that at all. But when you rephrased it, when you started with something they got, then it changed completely, right? You said, look, this is the greatest country in the world, maybe in the history of the world, and therefore our nature is the best nature in the world, and we have to do whatever it takes and be willing to sacrifice to protect our nature, right? Then they all go, yeah, that sounds fine. We're in on that. Because you started with a different framing. Right? They're waiting to hear a certain lead in, these people. And if they don't hear the right kind of introduction, they don't care about the content of what you've told them. So the idea from liberals and progressives is that you can go to people and tell them some facts about their situation. They don't care about facts yet. They're waiting to hear a pre-reasonable introduction to reality before they decide whether or not they're even going to pay attention to reality.
So what would you say, like, basically, like, one of the things that you mentioned in your article, which I really liked, it was a particular line, and I'll just read it for the listeners. You wrote that the ethos of the Restoration Project, which is what we've been talking about, is specifically engaged in the integration of incongruous opposites. It is the future and the past working together to overcome the present. Really love that line. Very Gibbsarian, very temporal. But I like, this seems to be doing at a real level what I think the centrists are claiming to do. And this is a debate that's been going on a lot, which is, okay, Biden, when he was on Obama's ticket, he was more to the right, even amidst other Democrats. And so it's an appeal to the right, right? The whole tradition of centrists right now is to punch left, appeal to the right, try to win them over. But it seems to me that to genuinely not punch left, but to seduce the right is an aesthetic approach that you're talking about. So it seems like they have the right idea, but they're going about it in a completely wrong way by trying to kind of appeal to, I don't know, what's his name, Kasich, going like, oh, don't worry about those crazy leftists. We're not really going to do any of those things. Biden's a strong guy. He's not going to actually work with the wild-eyed Marxists or whatever Trump called them. So there's that kind of appeal to the conservative demographic voter, but it's not this kind of appeal that you're talking about. To me, this seems like the more legit approach to actually reach people. It's like, yeah, let's protect green American soil. It's the most rich, most productive. It's our soil, so let's make sure it's healthy and resilient for our children. I think, yeah, I guess I'm just saying I like what you're doing here in remixing this, because you're taking the centrist argument and doing it better. You know what I mean? In a completely different way.
Yeah, and that's something that so-called second-tier thinking should be able to bring into the situation, because if we have anything going for us, it's our ability to appreciate these different cultural operating systems. Right? Not just pander to them, which the current centrism does. Now, I think any system is essentially a centrism, right? There's a status quo, there's an attractor, it self-stabilizes, it's metastable across a lot of variations of itself. And that's what we have in the current setup. There's a left and a right, and a way of integrating left and right that preserves the current kind of system that we're in, that we've been in for a while. If you want to get a different system, it also has to be a relatively stable but varying combination of left and right. So we're going to see parallels between, say, what the DNC is doing, which essentially, based on the power structure and the behavioral tendencies of the DNC, is not really trying to really improve lives and bring change to any significant degree as far as a progressive would be concerned. But they are pandering to these different sides and these different memes, and they've had a great deal of success with that. But if we are sort of meta-progressively looking down at the progressive space, so to speak, we should be able to inform it as to how it could do that more richly, more authentically, better informed by our sense of the ongoing relevance and reality of each of these stages and both of these sides of the polarization. Because if we're good at feeling into the validity of all these different things, then we should be able to help with the production of a centrism that's new, that more validly and more completely and more richly combines these opposites than the current liberal establishment is doing, even though it has been doing that and has had great success doing that, which is part of why it's still in power.
Yeah, it reminds me, I was reading a book by, I think it was Roger Scruton, the British conservative philosopher. And he made an interesting distinction. I think he was referencing Edmund Burke when he was talking about this. And he was talking about the difference between a conservative and a reactionary. And he said a reactionary is someone who is rebelling against the changing conditions of society by wanting to go back to a past state, whereas a conservative is actually, by its very nature, adaptive. And so the conservative person takes ideas, values, memes, identities from the past and remixes them to make them more suitable or compatible with current conditions, but they're still preserving the core essence or identity of what that thing was, just in a slightly modified form to go along with the societal changes, right? And I think this is interesting to think about too when we really get into real specifics. And something I've been curious about, I don't know if you've studied any of these guys, is like pre-industrial conservative, usually Christian critiques of capitalism, where people, especially during the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of German sociologists and some British, and Scottish philosophers talked about how capitalism corrupts the good moral spirit of the peasant people, right? And how these very strong communities, these Gemeinschaft communities with very strong moral bonds and moral ties with their own very strong ideas of value, character, and virtue, are being destroyed and run roughshod over by this modern industrializing, rational, utilitarian, instrumentalizing force. And so I think there are ways we can also, when it comes to specific policies, like advocating for Medicare for all, or advocating for UBI, or even something like nationalizing the oil industry, we can make arguments through the language and values of different memetic cultures that you're arguing for the policy through their language, right? I think there's so much avenue here for how you can do that, and getting really specific, because to me the difficult part always is, and this is where Sagar has been really getting criticized lately from the left, and the show Rising as a whole, is like, well, what the hell does he believe in policy-wise, right? Like, the rhetoric sounds good, but if you're not for Medicare for all and higher wages and ending the war and ending the drug war and all these things, then can we really agree? Can we really get along? So I think the devil's in the details, and how we argue for those details in the way that you're advocating for is important.
Yeah. Conservatism, or the right, or just polarization in general, is deeply ambiguous, in the sense of an integral map, that, so to speak, because it can apply to every memetic or developmental stage throughout history and even through prehistory, or it could mean specifically traditionalists as opposed to liberals and progressives. So I think what we need is to try to figure out, on the one hand, how do you fold in traditionalists, how do you fold in the past, but also how do you fold in what we might call conservative at any level, right? What could be more conservative than ecology? Let's preserve the environment. That sounds very conservative, and it is, but that's conservative at a progressive level, right? That's what we might call a green conservative or something like that. Maybe they're not too worried about upgrading the general system and the well-being of others, but they are concerned about themselves and their self-development and how they think, and deconstructing their mind and working with the environment. Right? There was a very interesting, Jon Stewart was on Joe Rogan, and listening to them, you get a very good sense of what, in an integral sense, is the left and right of green, right? They're very similar on a lot of things. They're very different on some others. One of them is more empathic and more oriented toward accepting people and making large changes. The other one's a little bit more focused on integrating aggression, individuals taking control of themselves and their lives and being healthier, that kind of stuff. Right? There's a smaller scale to conservative approaches at every level. It tends to stay closer to home, so to speak. As I think if you philosophically unpack it, you go right down to the fact that the cosmos, every form, every object has a certain kind of surface tension, a certain tendency to preserve itself, and a certain tendency to change, to be transformed into something else, right? So there's a conservative and a liberal at that basic level of reality. You run up, there's a conservative and liberal when the apes are learning language, like how seriously do you take the content of speech, right? You might say there's two partisan groups in that sense. There's a partisan phenomenon of that kind at every level of development. And in most cases, the conservative is narrower, more focused on their family, more focused on their immediate experience, more focused on what's come up for them personally. And that's a really good way. Like, it's smart. If you were evolution, say, and you wanted to design a team of evolving units, you would have them do both, right? You'd say half of these units should adapt to new things as we discover them. The other half should fall back and stay closer to the integration of old things, because those new things might turn out to be wrong, or the old things might turn out to be wrong. So a team that's doing both of those has a much higher evolutionary success rate. Now, there's a problem with that in the current situation, because the world might be changing so fast that if we wait for people to see how it personally affects them in order for them to register it in the conservative methodology, it might not be soon enough, right? You can easily have a conservative who's against gays their whole life, and then their daughter turns out to be gay, and they just change, because they're not fundamentally attached to consistency of positions. They're attached to what went on for them. They're not interested in general abstractions. The well-being of other people in general barely enters their mind, right? What a person could do and what's happened to a person is sort of their validation standard. And that's true at green, it's true at orange, it's true at blue amber, it's true at red. I think there's a lot of different ways that we can affirm that, and we should affirm that in any way that doesn't sabotage the general forward movement. And a guy like Burke, he made that argument, right? That you face a world of complexity. You're an individual facing complexity. You don't know how it works. You shouldn't throw everything away. You should sort of stay on your mat until you know for sure it works. He had this argument with Thomas Paine, and Thomas Paine was saying, look, the situation sucks right now in France. We've got nothing to lose. We've got to overturn it. And Burke is saying, yeah, okay, but you don't know what effect that's going to have. Don't get too involved. Hold back. We'll see what happens. Integrate the past. And you see a lot of guys who might be considered either progressive or even integral sort of conservatives with a mentality like that. I would say Nassim Taleb is a postmodern conservative. In some ways, Jordan Peterson is a postmodern conservative. When you look at the integral level, you see, right, there's a difference between what Brent Cooper wants to do and what Jordan Hall wants to do, right? And there's friction there. Brent gets very upset at what Jordan is proposing. But Brent is talking about general, universal things that upgrade the minimum level for all the people in the system. And Jordan is talking about individuals breaking off and forming little small experimental community upgrades. I'm going to start the civiums. And that's a very clear kind of left and right, liberal and conservative tendency, even within the higher evolutionary meta level space of what politics should be.
Yeah, and that's something actually, that tension there is something I've thought about quite a bit in terms of finding mediational ground between those two positions. For the most part, I do see the value in breaking off and experimenting with new modes of sense making, etc. But what I also understand Brent's position, which is we can't siphon everybody off. We can't atomize everyone. To what degree is this atomization, and to what degree is it a genuine sort of line of flight into the future that needs to be deeply agentic, subjective? Like I see both. I flip both, but I think one mediational ground might be just sort of having a sense of transparency between these two, and being able to achieve that is a little tricky, because to a great extent, folks who are more on the sort of let's sort of upgrade everyone's baseline well-being with these social projects that does involve getting involved in politics and in game A, so to speak, and not so much game B. There's a lot of pushback against that, because the project is, no, we don't want anything to do with that. So I like to actually bring these two together as a juxtaposition in and of itself, in that absolutely be experimenting with agentic and novel subjectivities, but work on your allergenic reaction to the status quo or the game A. Like, if the building is burning, everyone's got to get out of it for sure. And some degree that requires you to just help people where they are at the moment. That's not going to hurt you. You know, like if you go ahead and do the bare minimum participation in electoral politics or funding progressives or something along those lines, that's really not going to hurt your game B participation. You know, like you can be, by definition, you know, in it but not of it, right? Like, again, let's take a Christian value to look at it that way. So I'm very interested actually in perhaps the aesthetic of the liminal and the mediational to help these groups and communities not be so antagonistic even amongst each other, which is unfortunate. And it's also, I think, a symptom of what we've been talking about when you mentioned earlier in terms of the atomization and oppositionalism that occurs through this process of what Ryan was saying with industrialization and the kind of progressive onboarding of industrial capitalism and modernity that's been going on for hundreds of years. This is part of that. This oppositionalism of all against all, even those who are attempting to have some kind of regenerative or reconstitutive project. So I'm just rambling at this point, but I'm very interested in what you think of those mediational spaces between the Brent, our friend Brent, and then the halls of the world in our communities.
Well, I'm in favor of them, and there's 1,000 different kinds of them that we have to stay on top of, right? It's very good to try to do you know, even just simple speech mediation where two people talk to each other. Right. I do a lot of work with Brent. I'm very in favor of this general set of policies that he advocates for, and in the idea of a convergent consensus about general social and political change. Absolutely. But that's only one of the ways that that can come together, right? The aesthetic juxtapositions that we've been talking about today are another form of mediational space that puts those things together. There's a lot of different ways to do it. And like I said earlier, we need to be cautious about exaggerating the role of the verbal, whether that's two people talking to each other or whether that's a written document, whether it's a tweet or a Facebook post or a constitution or a book. All of these, we're very susceptible to being superstitiously impressed by the role of language. And in many ways, our thinking doesn't get free until we are sort of Taoistically somewhat apart from our own responses to the implications of words. Doesn't mean they don't have a role. They're very serious. They can do a lot of things, but they aren't necessarily the privileged place that we should be looking at these mediations, right? There are a lot of people, you know, if you just had them silent, two people from different backgrounds, which is a hugely important thing culturally. I imagine culture as a bit of an electrically conductive fluid, but if you leave it alone, the subfluids that make it up separate naturally. Unless you're stirring, they separate. When they separate, there's no electrical conductivity. So as long as people read the same books as their friends and dress the same as their friends and go to work with people who make the same basic amount of money as they do and speak similarly and look similarly, those are the areas of the separation of the fluids. You've got to mix them together, right? Maybe you mix them together in a war, but we'd love to be able to do it without a war. And one of the ways you mix people together is just have them work on a project together, right? Two guys from very different backgrounds digging a ditch together silently might establish more of this liminal mediational possibility for a new shared aesthetic than two people trying to debate to the point where they felt they could steel man each other's arguments competently and get on the same page. Because that verbal level that we can recognize is often dangerously thin.
So on the conceptual level, I was thinking about this. I mean, maybe in the meta web and these, you know, these sense-making spaces, perhaps game B is just destined to be the conservative wing of the sense-making communities, in the sense of embodying the Jeffersonian side of the Hamiltonian Jeffersonian debate at the founding of the country, favoring the local, the bioregional, the decentralized, the voluntary, right? Whereas Brent is coming from more of the Hamiltonian cosmopolitan socialist tradition. And I think that I see the same tensions in these debates. I guess it's kind of an archetypal political tension, you know, whether you want to call it freedom versus equality, or, you know, in the Tocquevillian sense, or just in terms of size and role of government. And, you know, and I've said this over on the show many times. I mean, I believe what Herbert Crowley said, which is Hamiltonian means to Jeffersonian ends. And I'd love to get Jordan Hall on the podcast and ask him this. What is one policy that Brent Cooper is advocating for that would get in the way of you doing these civium projects? And my argument has always been, if you have universal basic income, if you have universal health care, this will give people more time and energy to devote to doing decentralized local projects. If the government provides the resources and the positive and lays the groundwork for positive things to emerge, that would be awesome. And the government can also play a negative role in guaranteeing that your liberties will not be infringed on in a kind of totalitarian or fascistic sense, right? Example would be something like Trump deploying the military or the police to break up peaceful protests. And so I don't really see necessarily a huge incompatibility on the details, more on ideological talking points and the abstraction. And I think I would be interested to see, well, if we really drill down to it, what's the actual conflict here, other than perhaps a memetic or aesthetic tension?
I think we do need people to specialize in these different directions, but we need most people to be ready to understand that we need to fight on all fronts simultaneously, right? When I last talked to Jordan, we had a long discussion, and partly about the economics of civiums, right? And so there's something like UBI in every version of the civium he's thinking of. So that's not really different at the level of how you organize a system. It's just that he's thinking about smaller voluntary units with greater autonomy, and Brent might be thinking about the general background system. But if the policies are roughly the same and we see the shared logic, and you can imagine a situation in which if people are meeting a similar or greater standard, they can opt out of the general and try a peculiar one. There's no reason you can't have a system that has experimental zones as much as people would like. That's not incompatible with raising the general minimum for human well-being in a nation. I think there's a sense in which, because we hear people make passionate arguments for their specialization, which is good, and because we personally have the emotional attention problem of becoming tunnel-brained, right? We lock into exclusive zones of attention. Meditation is supposed to combat this, but it doesn't always do that. We lock into these things and we forget that it's an omnidirectional affair, where essentially there's no reason at all we shouldn't be supporting movements in every direction simultaneously, right? It's sort of like the question of, when the Sanders campaign sort of steps back from the Democratic primary, what should you do? Do we join and support the DNC and try to subvert them from within? Do we turn our back on them and start to form another party? Do we not worry about parties at all? And we just start trying to create a general groundswell of more people that have this kind of clarity about their populist spirit? And the answer is yes. We do all of those things all the time, right? This has only ever been a fight, and it's only ever been on all fronts simultaneously. There's no disagreement about making Earth better and also going to Mars. Those are both ways of solving the same problem, which is sustained human well-being. So we have to have this kind of, Cthulhu attitude, this multi-tentacled attitude, which is we are all always fighting on all these fronts, and we don't have to decide between them. Some people are instinctively moved to focus more on one of the areas, great. But there's no puzzle, there's no debate as to which one we should be working on. We should be working on all of them all the time.
And one more question I have too with the whole, and let me put my mean green mean hat on for just a second. All right. So my frustration, and I've talked to some of my friends who are involved with Game B about this, is that a lot of these guys like Jim Rutt and Jordan Hall, like they're pretty privileged guys, like economically speaking. They've won Game A, they've been financially very successful. And I think what people tend to not understand about the whole self-organizing thing that gets a lot of hype, and rightly so in these circles, is that self-organization plays out differently according to development. And so self-organizing, the force of self-organization autopoiesis in integral level communities and thinkers is very different than in the ghetto. And there are certain times in certain communities, certain cultures, certain levels of consciousness in which self-organization, I don't think really works very well, and that you need a certain level of structure and a certain level of sense-making and certain type of authority and decision-making to better guide those communities so that eventually they could maybe enter into a more naturally self-organizing level where self-organization would be a net positive for them and for the whole. Do you have any thoughts on that, Layman?
I think that, philosophically speaking, it's ultimately impossible to discuss any of these options without already having the other one built into the frame. Like if you go closely enough into the logic of what anybody's saying, you end up with something like a Taoist yin-yang kind of take, which is if somebody says top down is a problem, well, what they really mean is you need the right kind of top down to create more bottom up solutions. Right. And if they are worried about bottom up solutions, what they really are saying is they need the right kind of bottom up phenomenon. It's got to be healthy enough and it's got to contribute to benevolent top down solutions. And this kind of thing where you see that the reciprocal of what you're saying is built into what you're saying as you're saying it, it's not only empowering because you can stop worrying about the apparent plurality of options since they're built into each other, but you also have a situation in which your target design space is narrowed. Right? The more different things you have to simultaneously achieve, the narrower the number of things that achieve those. Right? So if you say we only want self-organizing systems insofar as they support healthy, positive, universalist top-down solutions, and we only want the top-down solutions that make it easier for the flourishing of self-organizing systems. Well, that's a much smaller set of potential targets than you might otherwise be looking at. Right? You've got to solve a problem in that little space. And so because there are fewer options in the design space, you are more likely to find the one that works than if you had a much greater range of options because you had fewer limit constraints on what those could be. So we're really in a good position the more we can see how these sides bind each other. They bind each other in a way that focuses us where we have to go and not any of the other directions that we could go in.
So we have Brent in the chat actually talking a little bit about this, and one of the things he's mentioning, which I think is absolutely true, is that the reality of this, beyond kind of understanding this abstractly, is that these groups attract certain personalities with certain dispositions, whether progressive, Hamiltonian, or not, and there's an allergen that takes place. There is an immunization against the other side. So if we go to game B spaces, maybe Hall himself is not very interested in progressive values, articulating them, et cetera, et cetera. This is his kind of like forte, right? So it's going to attract those people. Those people are going to develop an immunization or defense against progressive or mean green meme, et cetera, et cetera. And anytime that shows up, rather than metabolizing it in a healthy way, it's rejected, it's ousted, et cetera. So we have this sort of natural tribalization, perhaps exacerbated by neoliberal atomization in these social media environments. How do we really kind of navigate that kind of gritty, messy work? You know what I mean? Like, I understand the Taoist sense, and I even agree, and I vibe with it. And we, I think, are naturally going to this in our conversation. Is like, hey, we need the agentic subjective as the conservative angle, and we need the progressive social, et cetera. But when we get into the reality of these communities, there's so much divisiveness and kind of just not seeing it that way, right? You post something green or progressive in one community, and it might even be deleted. It might be lambasted. They don't really see it. Now, I'll give my like 10-second answer, which is what I think is what we're doing needs to be more at the forefront. Just like showing, okay, this isn't really an irreconcilable oppositionalism. We just need to do what Hall is doing and also kind of show, memetically speaking, that there's the other side to this as well, and they're always working together. And the more that is showcased in these communities or in these media ecological spaces, the better, as a sort of solvent to that oppositionalism. But I'd like to hear your take on sort of like, what do we do with the reality of this fighting?
Principle, it should work perfectly. There's no reason you can't work on your civium for 3 years, so then vote Bernie one afternoon and go back to your civium. They're perfectly compatible in principle. But it's natural for human beings to tribally exclude each other. Partly that's because we're specializing in different areas, and partly because it's, the assholishness we inherit from a terrible history to some degree. But you undermine that by creating the proliferation, by cultivating the proliferation of factors that undermine that, right? One of those factors is the kind of thing we're doing. It's more conversations where we bypass the normal kernel of antagonism between these different sets of perspectives. Another way is to spread, like I was saying earlier, things whose aesthetic naturally triggers and cancels both left and right polarization simultaneously to some degree. The more of those that are out in the world, the more people get a background sense that they don't need to be locked into one of those because it's perfectly compatible with the other one, even if it feels weird up front. And then a lot of it also is what we might call spiritual, religious, and to some degree therapeutic work, which is, why do we do that? Why do we tribalize? Why are we not interested in our own failures? Why are we not taking a constantly upgraded moral reckoning? Why are we not caring enough? Why are we blocked off to other interpretations of stuff, which turns out to be roughly what we're trying to say, just from a different angle, right? So that's a moral development in human beings. It means we have to decide and disseminate the idea that we like that experience. It's okay to feel cognitive dissonance. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to run up against perspectives that you don't like, that's an absolutely fine feeling. It's something we can get better at. The more we do it, the stronger we feel and the more things we include. So it's excellent for us. And then we have to have the kind of mindful emotional qualities that make us able to undergo that feeling without freaking out. I always tend to say there's two emotions humans are terrible at. One is happiness and one is failure, right? We're not very good in the positive psychology sense of feeling the worthiness and appreciation for the world, even to the point of experiencing ecstatic overflow. And we're also not very good at feeling thwarted, frustrated that we did something wrong, that we can't reconcile two parts of ourselves, that our behavior isn't living up to our ideals. We're terrible at both those sets of feelings. And so we need an education system and adjunct institutions like spiritual and religious and therapeutic institutions that make people feel good about that experience. Because otherwise you could set up a world in which everything in principle works really well. But if all the humans who are enacting the processes just pull back from the disturbing feeling that they would have to cross in order to get to the hybridization, even the best system will behave abominably.
Yeah, well said. And this is something that also frustrates me, and because it's something I care a lot about. And it kind of gets to your other essay, Layman, that you wrote that I really liked, which was about values and people not really knowing what their values are. And I agree with that so much, because as a mediator, I'm confident in saying that the sole job of a mediator is basically to just clarify what the hell people's values are that they don't know about. And so I was thinking about it as a mediator, as a virtue ethicist, or a mediator as like a 21st century Socrates, who says, okay, I see that you're really upset. You're upset at that guy, you're upset at this thing, you're upset at that idea, right? And what is the underlying value that wants to be heard and acknowledged, right? Let's clarify that once we discover it, and then let's find a concrete way of actualizing or concretizing that value into physical reality. And usually what mediates between people's internal values and reality is symbols, right? So some kind of symbolic gesture can be very strong for helping people to feel that their values are being concretized, and for them to feel more secure in that. And so my whole thing is, you can cultivate your value in the affirmative, clarify it, talk about it, amplify it, symbolically instantiate it, and don't worry about what the other guys are doing who are promoting values that you think are opposite of yours, right? I can be all for personal responsibility, bootstrapping, hard work, sanctity of marriage, whatever. And I don't care about what the gay people are, don't worry about that stuff, and just focus on in the affirmative and building and concretizing, actualizing your own symbolic universe. And I feel like if people could do that and become more secure in those in your own values, then we wouldn't need to define them by reactively contrasting ourselves in the negative against the polar opposite of those values.
I couldn't agree more, Ryan. I think there's on the one hand, an obvious need for what we might call a legion of integral or meta-modern diplomats of various kinds, who can hear people's perspectives and affirm them and say them back and elicit the abstract value that's powering that perspective, and then speak to that, and then also speak to how that could move forward and maybe take a different form that's more workable in a given situation. So we need a lot of people to be doing that. That's much more important than knowing about how meta theories operate. At the same time, it's part of what I was saying before, which is a huge part of this is internal practice, right? And that's no surprise to anyone. But one of the things that the right has had going for it over the years is a tendency to emphasize self-development, self-help, right? There's a lot of that stuff that's bullshit, but the fact that the left doesn't have something like that strongly enough means we just cede it to the people who are offering us the worst possible way forward. This is a tremendous, in a way, this has always been the right wing of progressives, which is hippies, back to the land, spirituality, holistic health, the way we eat, the way we think, the way we imagine reality. The new age, in a sense, was the right wing of the sort of left political social orientation of the progressive movement that came out from the 60s, right? People who wanted just to focus on what am I going through and how can I make that better? You need that person to succeed at that task in order to become involved in these other more general social phenomena. And clarifying and eliciting values, I think, is one of the most powerful methods. Now, it's not a method you can apply on a mass scale, right? You can't do it for everyone in the country all at once. But in every individual interaction, you can basically be like Socrates. Every story about Socrates that Plato wrote down is the story of, he runs into some people who did a thing. They carved a sculpture, they won a poetry contest, and he wants to know why. What's your secret? What's the essence of the skill? And what's the value that powers that skill? And they haven't thought about it before, but he intersubjectively elucidates and clarifies the underlying value. And the more you contemplate its valuableness, the more you see other areas it could apply, but also you see its transcendental generality, right? That's, in a way, that's fundamentally Socrates' method, because a lot of what we value is subconscious and inactive. We don't know how to say it. We don't recognize it in ourselves. When we speak about values, we often are speaking from our values rather than accurately speaking about them. So we try to get an idea of what people value, and we could be way off. We end up with crass public generalizations that really do a disservice to what people actually care about. But if we want to find what they actually care about, you have to catch what was implied in what they were saying, what they were doing, something that's lurking in the subliminal subconscious area of themselves that you have to try to name and experimentally call forward, which is it is to their benefit, but they don't know how to do it. We all don't know how to do it well enough, no matter who we are.
Yeah, well said. And just really quickly, what you were saying, I think of it as what John Vervaeke calls a transparency to opacity shift, right? You kind of step back, you turn the subject into an object, and then you can have more detachment and interrogate it from a more objective perspective. And this is a very Steve McIntoshian way to go about it, but I think you can have ways of clarifying and strengthening and emboldening your values, and also do that with what are traditionally considered opposing values, and do a both and kind of thing. And I really like your essay on individuation individuals and dividuals, and individuation and dividuation. And I've been thinking about that too, about, Jordan Peterson talks about in his lecture on marionettes and Pinocchio, about cutting the strings, and that as a kind of individuative process of becoming a whole and unique individual that you are. You're distancing yourself and extracting yourself from the collective mush, from Robert Keegan's level 3 to more of a level 4 and upwards. And there's also the concurrent process of dividuation, which is seeing the interconnectedness and the quantum entanglement of yourself and all of the causes and conditions and systems that you were brought up in. And those are not necessarily strings that you want to cut, right? These are strings that are just permanently there and will always be there. And I think the implications of realizing that interconnectedness is really necessary to solve these complex issues such as climate change or coronavirus pandemics. And so again, maybe you can just riff a little bit on that essay and think about how you've been able to kind of commensurate or integrate or oscillate between individuals and individuals, and the ramifications of that integration for the culture wars.
Well, it was a fun topic, and I also thought about Steve McIntosh when I was writing it, because it's an issue he and I have discussed. I think there's a very natural extension of developmental theory, which is that you have to differentiate things in order to integrate them, right? There's the old alchemical formula of solve et coagula. You got to take it apart and put it back together in order to get a better version of it. I think that's I would argue, it's at the heart of religious and spiritual developments, and also at the heart of all general developmental shifts. You can't really get to the next level until you were able to unpack the previous level properly. And a lot of that is critique. You have to be able to see what the hidden fault lines were in the system that you're operating from before you can unpack those pieces and put them together in a new order. But I think the more fundamental thing, in that article you mentioned, it touches on religion, touches on this other notion of what might be the quasi-metaphysical substructures of individuality apart from the developmental process. There may be some kind of syntactic predisposition in reality for individuality such that we can approximate individuality from our inner plurality at any given time. But fundamentally, what we find ourselves to be, if we have a look, right, any mindfulness technique where you have a look at what's going on, is going to find that you are full of a whole bunch of things that disagree, right? That they are absolutely embedded in your life, that a lot of them come from other people, that a lot of them not only argue with each other, but appear to operate on completely different media wavelengths, right? what do emotions and thoughts and sensations and perceptions really have in common? They're very different streams in some ways. So you've got all this different stuff going on. You have all these different memories. You have something like a different agency in every moment, right? You do something at night and in the morning you think, holy shit, why did I do that? It's as if you're a completely different person. This is the situation we find ourselves in, right? Competing or sometimes cooperating subjective subsystems. But that doesn't mean we can't work them together more aptly. And in fact, I would argue that the moments where we do successfully harmonize, which is create synchronized relative balance in prominence between different subjective subsystems, those are the moments in which we experience an excess quality, a beingness, an overflow, a surplus of coherent meaningfulness that we might interpret as a self or an energy or an other. But essentially, it's this extra that allows us to move forward developmentally, to power us beyond the current uses of our energy that we have right now, to reflect ourselves back to ourselves in a more authentic and more profound way. So essentially, we accomplish a spiritual move every time we're able to coordinate subsystems or selves in a way that makes them more integrated, more unified. So it's not just that we're in this dialectic between our inner plurality and our potential individuality. It's that trying to cultivate this plurality into a non-reductive integration is the engine of our individual forward development.
Well, I think we're just out of time, but I want to thank you, Layman. Where can people find you online, connect with you, if they have some ideas?
I guess if they look for the integral stage, or you guys obviously read a lot of my Substack articles, they can go there. Probably if you just search for my name, you'll find a bunch of outdated and contradictory things.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. We got to have you back on
great,
sometime.
you guys. I'd love to do this again. I feel like I could go on for a few more hours.
Yeah. Awesome.
And
Thank you, Layman.
like I say, I love the work you're doing. I love the show. I love the growing down concept of the show. This is very much what should be happening, I think.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. We will catch you probably next weekend. So take care.